What would you say if I told you that a fragile little girl, born in a poor corner of Germany, would one day become the greatest empress in Russian history? That her name would echo across centuries as Catherine the Great, a ruler who shaped not only Russia, but the course of Europe itself. The year was 1729. In the small Prussian town of Stettin, now Szczecin, Poland, a baby girl entered the world. She was Christin Sophie Friederike Auguste von Anhalt-Zerbst. Her family was noble, yes, but not wealthy, nor particularly influential. In fact, Sophie's parents belonged to one of those countless minor princely houses of the Holy Roman Empire, noble in name, but struggling for status. No one could have imagined that this child would one day rule one of the largest empires on earth. From the very beginning, however, Sophie was different. While many young noblewomen of her rank spent their time learning etiquette, needlework, and music, Sophie devoured books. She learned French, the language of European diplomacy, and absorbed the works of philosophers. By her teenage years, she was already captivated by the writings of Montesquieu, Voltaire, and other Enlightenment thinkers. Her tutors would later remark on her sharp mind, her iron will, and her uncanny ability to remember details. Yet, brilliance alone did not promise her greatness. For all her intellect, Sophie's future seemed destined to be ordinary. A marriage to some middling German prince, a life lived in provincial courts far from the great centers of power. But Sophie harbored secret ambitions. She longed for something greater, for influence, for change, for a chance to leave her mark on history. That chance arrived sooner than she could have imagined. In Russia, Empress Elizabeth Petrovna, daughter of Peter the Great, was seeking a bride for her nephew and heir, the young Grand Duke Peter of Holstein-Gottorp. The boy was awkward, sickly, and, truth be told, not particularly suited to rule. But dynastic politics demanded he marry, and Elizabeth was determined to secure the succession. Sophie, with her noble blood, her ties to the German aristocracy, and her seemingly pliant character, was chosen. At just 15 years old, Sophie was summoned to Russia. Imagine the scene. A teenage girl leaving behind her family, her homeland, and everything familiar to step into the frozen, glittering world of the Russian court. St. Petersburg was a city unlike anything she had ever seen. Palaces of gold and marble rising out of the snow, a court filled with intrigue, whispers, and rivalry. Here, alliances were made and broken in a single night. Here, fortunes rose and fell with a glance from the empress. Sophie quickly realized that if she wanted to survive, she would need more than intelligence. She would need resilience, cunning, and above all, the ability to bend without breaking. Her very survival depended on her ability to adapt, and adapt she did. Upon her arrival, Sophie converted to the Russian Orthodox faith, taking the name Ekaterina Alexeyevna, or Catherine. With this baptism, she symbolically shed her German past and bound herself to Russia forever. She spoke Russian tirelessly until she mastered the language, something her fiancé, Peter, never bothered to do. She studied Russian customs, history, and politics, carefully building her identity not as a foreign princess, but as a true daughter of Russia. That it was this transformation, from Sophie to Catherine, that would lay the foundation for everything to come. Little did anyone know that the young bride, so seemingly obedient and quiet, would one day eclipse her weak husband and seize the throne of Russia for herself. But those were battles for another day. For now, Catherine was simply a girl in a glittering cage, learning to navigate the treacherous corridors of the imperial court. When Catherine first set foot in Russia, she was still Sophie at heart, a young German princess filled with dreams and uncertainty. But the Russian court would not allow her the luxury of innocence. The palaces of St. Petersburg glittered with chandeliers and gilded halls, yet beneath the surface lay venomous intrigues, whispered conspiracies, and constant threats to survival. It was a world where a misplaced word could mean disgrace, and a careless step could end in exile. Or worse, at the heart of this world stood Empress Elizabeth Petrovna, daughter of the great Peter the Great. Elizabeth was a woman of immense charm and energy, adored by the Russian people for her beauty and extravagance. She ruled with authority, yet her court was infamous for its excesses: endless balls, lavish banquets, and the constant shifting of favorites. Elizabeth herself had no children, and so the future of Russia rested on her nephew, Grand Duke Peter, the boy destined to marry Catherine. But Peter was a disappointment. Raised in Germany, Peter had grown up idolizing Prussia, not Russia. He spoke German more comfortably than Russian, and his manners were childish, even cruel. Obsessed with military toys, he would spend hours drilling his tin soldiers, ignoring matters of state. Worse still, he harbored open admiration for Frederick the Great of Prussia, a bitter enemy of Russia at the time. To many at court, Peter seemed not only unfit to rule, but also dangerously disloyal to Russia's interests. Catherine saw this clearly. The contrast between herself and her fiancé was striking. While Peter stumbled and alienated those around him, Catherine worked tirelessly to win favor. She embraced orthodoxy with genuine devotion, even fasting more strictly than required. She practiced her Russian until she spoke with eloquence, while Peter stubbornly clung to his German tongue. She read everything she could about Russian history, culture, and politics, determined to prove that she was no foreigner but a true Russian at heart. This transformation was not lost on Empress Elizabeth. The Empress grew increasingly fond of Catherine, admiring her intelligence and adaptability. In 1745, the marriage finally took place. Sophie Friederike Auguste von Anhalt-Zerbst-Vascona. In her place stood Grand Duchess Catherine Alexeyevna of Russia. Yet, married life was far from a fairy tale. Catherine quickly discovered that her husband was immature, cold, and even abusive at times. Their marriage was loveless and unconsummated for years. Catherine, however, refused to let despair consume her. Instead, she turned her energy inward, cultivating herself. She read voraciously: philosophy, law, history, military strategy. She corresponded secretly with Enlightenment thinkers in Europe, including Voltaire, whose ideas of reason and governance fascinated her. It was in these years of isolation that Catherine's resolve hardened. She learned to hide her true thoughts behind a mask of composure. She perfected the art of patience, of waiting for the right moment to act. She studied the court like a general studies the battlefield, memorizing who supported whom, who whispered in whose ear. Every smile, every gesture, every silence. Catherine transformed them into weapons of survival. The Russian people, meanwhile, began to notice her. Unlike her aloof husband, Catherine showed warmth and empathy. She visited hospitals, spoke to soldiers, and took an interest in the conditions of the poor. Slowly but surely, she began to win not only the favor of the nobility, but also the affection of the common people. Still, danger was never far. Catherine's position remained precarious. She had no children yet, an unforgivable failure in the eyes of the court. Enemies whispered that she was barren, that she was unfit to be the mother of Russia's future. And all the while, her husband's erratic behavior threatened to destroy the dynasty's stability. In this tense atmosphere, Catherine learned the most important lesson of her life. In the Russian court, survival was not enough. To secure her place, she would have to be more than a dutiful wife or a patient consort. She would need to be strong, strategic, and, when the time came, utterly ruthless, and soon, that time would come. The wedding of Catherine and Peter in 1745 was supposed to secure the Romanov dynasty, but in truth, it planted the seeds of crisis. From the very beginning, the union was troubled. Peter, immature and cruel, treated his young wife with cold disdain. He preferred the company of his mistresses, his toy soldiers, and his bottles of vodka. Catherine, on the other hand, longed for partnership, intellect, and purpose. What she received was neglect. Their private life was disastrous. For years, the marriage remained unconsummated, causing whispers at court. The Empress Elizabeth grew anxious. How could the dynasty survive without an heir? Catherine endured humiliation in silence. In letters to trusted friends, she would later describe her marriage as a long chain of sufferings. Yet Catherine was not the type to surrender to despair. If her husband gave her no love, she would find strength in her own mind. She filled her days with books, Machiavelli's The Prince, Montesquieu's The Spirit of Laws, Plutarch's Lives of Noble Greeks and Romans. She devoured the ideas of the Enlightenment, carefully shaping her vision of leadership. Philosophy, for Catherine, was not abstract theory. It was preparation. In these years, Catherine also learned the delicate art of building allies. She charmed courtiers, befriended generals, and won over influential statesmen. While Peter sulked and drank, Catherine cultivated a reputation as intelligent, gracious, and sympathetic. The Russian nobility began to see in her something they did not see in Peter: the possibility of stability, of leadership, of a monarch worthy of Russia's destiny. But still, she needed one thing above all: a child. After nearly a decade of barren marriage, Catherine gave birth to a son, Paul, in 1754. Officially, the child was declared the heir of Peter. Unofficially, whispers spread that the boy's true father was Sergei Saltykov, a young Russian nobleman and Catherine's first lover. The truth was never proven, and perhaps it did not matter. What mattered was that Catherine had done what Peter could not. She had secured the dynasty's future. With Paul's birth, Catherine's position at court strengthened. Empress Elizabeth adored the child, taking him into her care and raising him as her own. Catherine, however, was denied the joy of raising her son. She was pushed aside, left in a gilded cage, while Peter continued to disgrace himself with foolish antics and German sympathies. Catherine's patience deepened. She understood that her husband was not merely unfit as a partner. He was unfit as a ruler. His open admiration for Frederick the Great of Prussia, at a time when Russia was at war with Prussia, was seen as treasonous by many. Officers in the army began to despise him. Nobles whispered that the future of Russia could not be trusted to Peter. Catherine listened. She waited. She learned to hide her true ambitions behind a mask of silence and obedience. But inside, she was making a vow. If Peter ascended the throne, Russia would suffer, and she would not allow that. The next great test came with the death of Empress Elizabeth in 1762. Peter, at last, became Emperor Peter III of Russia. For Catherine, the moment of truth had arrived. She was no longer the powerless German princess who had arrived at court 15 years earlier. She was a mother, a woman admired by the military, respected by the nobility, and quietly supported by the people. And she knew, with icy certainty, that if Russia was to be saved, Peter must fall, and she must rise. The marriage that had begun in shadows was about to explode into open conflict, not between husband and wife, but between emperor and empress, between weakness and strength. When Empress Elizabeth died in January 1762, the throne passed to her nephew, Peter III. For Catherine, this was both a moment of peril and opportunity. Overnight, she became the wife of the emperor, consort to the ruler of the Russian Empire. But the truth was undeniable. Peter was not loved. In just 6 months, Peter managed to alienate almost everyone. He ended the war with Prussia abruptly, returning territories won by Russian soldiers and humiliating the army. He abandoned Orthodox traditions and openly mocked Russian customs, favoring German ones instead. He confiscated church lands, enraging the clergy, and insulted the nobility with childish arrogance. Even worse, he openly discussed divorcing Catherine and sending her to a convent. The court seethed. The army rumbled, and Catherine listened. She understood that Peter's unpopularity was her greatest weapon. Over years of quiet observation, she had cultivated allies among the nobility and the powerful imperial guard, the elite soldiers who had made and unmade tsars before. Now, whispers of rebellion grew louder, and all eyes turned to Catherine. First, Catherine hesitated. A coup was dangerous. Failure meant exile, or worse, execution. But when word reached her that Peter planned to disinherit her son Paul and cast her aside, hesitation turned to resolve. She knew there could be no survival without action. That on the morning of July 9th, 1762, Catherine made her move. With the support of the Guard regiment stationed in St. Petersburg, she rode to the barracks, dressed not in silks but in the uniform of a soldier. Before thousands of troops, she declared herself not merely consort, but Catherine, sole ruler of Russia. The soldiers, already disillusioned with Peter, roared their approval. Bishops blessed her. Nobles pledged their loyalty. It was a bloodless revolution, at least in the capital. Peter, stunned by the speed of events, fled to his palace at Oranienbaum. Within days, he realized he was abandoned. His own officers deserted him, and he signed an abdication. For a brief moment, it seemed Catherine would allow him to live in quiet exile. But fate had other plans. Just a week after his abdication, Peter was dead. Officially, he died in a drunken brawl with his guards. Unofficially, many believed he was assassinated on Catherine's orders, or at least with her knowledge. The truth remains a mystery, but one thing was clear: Catherine was now empress. Her rise was extraordinary. A minor German princess had overthrown her husband and seized the throne of Russia, not through bloodline, but through brilliance, courage, and sheer political skill. The world was stunned. Voltaire himself would later write with admiration, calling her the embodiment of enlightened rulership. But Catherine knew that the coup was only the beginning. Taking the throne was one thing. Keeping it was another. She was a foreigner by birth, a woman in a man's world, and her claim to power rested not on heredity, but on force. If she was to survive, she would have to prove that she could rule not just as an empress, but as a sovereign equal to Peter the Great himself. In the days following her coronation, Catherine set the tone for her reign. She promised to govern wisely, to protect the church, to strengthen the army, and to uphold Russian traditions. She reached out to nobles and peasants alike, presenting herself as the mother of the nation. Step by step, she transformed what could have been seen as a scandalous usurpation into the dawn of a golden era. The coup of 1762 was more than the fall of Peter. It was the birth of Catherine the Great. When Catherine ascended the throne in 1762, she was just 33 years old. She had survived a loveless marriage, outmaneuvered her enemies, and staged a daring coup. But her true challenge was only beginning: how to transform herself from a usurper into a legitimate sovereign of the vast Russian Empire. Catherine understood better than anyone that Russia was unlike any other European state. It was enormous, stretching across forests, steppes, and frozen plains. Its population was overwhelmingly poor, bound in the chains of serfdom. Its nobility was powerful but restless, eager for privileges and wary of reform. Its clergy demanded respect, yet often resisted progress. To rule Russia required not just strength, but vision. Catherine found that vision in the Enlightenment. From her youth, she had devoured the works of Voltaire, Montesquieu, and Diderot. Now, as empress, she sought to turn philosophy into policy. She corresponded with Voltaire for years, exchanging hundreds of letters. She invited Diderot to her court, offering him patronage when his encyclopedia was banned in France. To the philosophers of Europe, Catherine presented herself as a philosopher on the throne, an enlightened monarch who would bring reason, progress, and tolerance to Russia. In 1767, she unveiled her boldest initiative, the Nakaz, or instruction. This sweeping document outlined her vision for governance. Drawing from Montesquieu's ideas, Catherine condemned torture, advocated for religious tolerance, and declared that laws should serve the people, not enslave them. She summoned the Legislative Commission, bringing together representatives from across the empire to discuss reforms. The world watched in awe. Here was a woman, ruling one of the most autocratic states in Europe, openly championing Enlightenment ideals. Voltaire hailed her as the Star of the North. Monarchs in Europe looked on with admiration and unease, but ideals and reality rarely walk hand in hand. Catherine soon discovered that reform in Russia was far more difficult than penning enlightened decrees. The nobles resisted any attempt to limit their power over the serfs. The clergy bristled at the loss of land and privileges. Even the legislative commission, meant to be a symbol of progress, dissolved into squabbles and was quietly disbanded. Catherine, pragmatic as always, adjusted her course. She continued to speak the language of enlightenment to Europe, but at home she pursued policies that strengthened her own authority. She rewarded the nobility with greater privileges in exchange for loyalty. She expanded the empire's territory through war and diplomacy, proving that her reign was not only philosophical but also imperial. For Catherine, ideas were weapons, as valuable as cannons. She knew that her image mattered. She cultivated the portrait of herself as the Mother of Russia, draped in imperial robes, a ruler of destiny. She patronized the arts, founded the Hermitage Museum, and encouraged architecture that rivaled the grandeur of Paris and Vienna. St. Petersburg became not just a capital, but a stage where Catherine displayed her vision of Russia as a great European power. And yet, beneath the glitter of her court, problems festered. The peasants remained crushed by poverty and bondage. Corruption seeped through the bureaucracy. The gap between her enlightened words and the harsh realities of serfdom grew ever wider. Catherine knew the danger, but she also knew the limits of her power. Still, compared to her husband Peter, her rule was a miracle. Russia was stable, respected abroad, and guided by a sovereign who combined intellect with iron determination. Catherine had proven that she was no usurper, no foreigner. She was, in every sense, the ruler of Russia, but the empire she was building would soon face its greatest test. Not from nobles, not from philosophers, but from the very peasants whose lives had been left unchanged. The flames of rebellion were rising. For all the glitter of Catherine's enlightened court, life in the Russian countryside remained grim. Serfs, the backbone of the empire, were bound to their landlords, treated little better than slaves. While Catherine spoke of justice and reason in her nakaz, in reality, she had granted the nobility even greater control over the peasants. The gap between lofty ideals and brutal reality grew ever wider, and resentment simmered like an underground fire waiting to erupt. That fire finally burst forth in 1773 in the form of a rebellion that would test Catherine's throne like never before. Its unlikely leader was Emelian Pugachev, a former Cossack officer with a gift for deception and charisma. Escaping from military service, Pugachev re-emerged with a bold claim. He was not Emelian Pugachev at all, but Peter III, Catherine's deposed and supposedly murdered husband. The story was wild, but in the desperate countryside, it was believable. Many peasants never saw Peter's body, and rumors had long swirled that he was still alive. To the downtrodden, Pugachev's tale was irresistible. The rightful Tsar had returned to free them from Catherine's oppressive nobles. Pugachev promised land, freedom, and the end of serfdom. His words spread like wildfire across the Volga region. Thousands flocked to his banner. Cossacks, serfs, discontented soldiers, and persecuted minorities. Villages rose in revolt. Landlords were slaughtered, and entire provinces slipped from imperial control. For Catherine, the uprising was a nightmare. At first, officials underestimated Pugachev, dismissing him as a mere bandit. But as the rebellion grew, it became clear that this was no simple revolt. It was a full-scale civil war. Pugachev's forces captured cities, defeated imperial troops, and terrorized the countryside. For nearly 2 years, large swathes of Russia lay outside Catherine's grasp. The Empress responded with cold determination. She dispatched seasoned generals to crush the rebellion, calling on the loyalty of the nobility and the discipline of the army. It was a brutal campaign. Villages suspected of supporting Pugachev were burned. Rebels were executed en masse. Step by step, the imperial army closed in 1775. Betrayal sealed Pugachev's fate. His own followers, weary of defeat, handed him over to the authorities. Dragged in chains to Moscow, he was paraded before the people as a living warning against treason. His execution was gruesome, drawn and quartered, his body displayed as a symbol of imperial justice. The rebellion was crushed, but its shadow lingered. Tens of thousands had died, and entire regions lay in ruins. Catherine, once hailed as the enlightened monarch, emerged hardened and wary. She realized that the Enlightenment ideal she admired could not easily be applied to Russia's vast, restless population. Instead of freeing the serfs, she tightened control. Nobles were granted even greater authority, while surveillance of the countryside increased to Europe. Catherine continued to present herself as the patron of philosophy, the ally of Voltaire, the friend of reason. But within Russia, she became more cautious, more pragmatic, and in some ways, more ruthless. The dream of reform gave way to the reality of survival. And yet, even as rebellion smoldered, Catherine's gaze turned outward. If Russia was restless at home, it could grow powerful abroad. The empire was poised to expand its borders, to test its strength against the Ottoman Turks, and to reshape the very map of Europe. If Pugachev's rebellion revealed the fragility of Russia at home, Catherine's foreign policy revealed its power abroad. From the moment she seized the throne, she understood that legitimacy came not only from ruling wisely, but from ruling victoriously. To survive as a woman on the throne, she would need to do what her predecessors had done: expand Russia's might through war and diplomacy. Her first great challenge was the Ottoman Empire, long the rival of Russia in the Black Sea region. For centuries, Russia had been locked out of warm water ports, its ships confined to frozen seas. Control of the Black Sea was the dream of every Russian ruler, a dream Catherine was determined to achieve. In 1768, war erupted. The Ottomans, once a terror to Europe, still commanded vast armies, but Catherine's modernizing policies gave Russia a new advantage. Under her generals, most famously Alexei Orlov and Grigory Potemkin, Russian forces struck with unexpected brilliance. The highlight came in 1770, when the Russian fleet, despite its inexperience, defeated the Ottoman navy at the Battle of Chezham in the Aegean Sea. The victory shocked Europe. Russia, once considered a backward giant, had proven itself a formidable naval power. On land, Russian armies marched deep into Ottoman territory, capturing fortresses and securing the steppe. The war ended in 1774 with the Treaty of Kukuk-Kainarka, a landmark triumph. For the first time, Russia gained access to the Black Sea, the right to protect Orthodox Christians within the Ottoman Empire, and vast new lands. It was a turning point. Russia was no longer a marginal power, but a central player in European politics. Catherine's ambitions did not stop there. She turned her gaze to Poland, a once great kingdom now weakened by internal division. Through a series of cunning diplomatic maneuvers, Catherine ensured Russian dominance over Polish affairs. In 1772, Russia, along with Austria and Prussia, carried out the first partition of Poland, carving up Polish lands for themselves. It was the beginning of the end for Poland as an independent state. By the final partition in 1795, Poland had vanished from the map, absorbed by its neighbors, its fate sealed by Catherine's hand. Through these victories, Catherine not only expanded Russia's borders, but also reshaped its identity. The empire now stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea, from the Polish plains to the Crimean steppes. Russia was no longer simply a northern colossus. It was a European empire, rich in land, resources, and influence. But war brought more than glory. It brought heroes and lovers. One name stands above all: Grigory Potemkin, the brilliant general and statesman who became Catherine's closest companion. Together, they dreamed of a Greek project, a grand plan to drive the Ottomans out of Europe and restore a Christian empire in Constantinople. While the dream never fully materialized, Potemkin's campaign secured Crimea for Russia in 1783, giving Catherine her cherished Black Sea stronghold. The annexation of Crimea was celebrated as one of Catherine's greatest achievements. She herself toured the newly conquered lands, greeted by triumphal arches and villages decorated in her honor. European observers marveled at her audacity. Russia was now a Mediterranean power, and Catherine was hailed as the conqueror who had given her empire access to the world's warm seas. Yet, these victories came at a cost. Endless wars drained the treasury, strained the army, and placed heavier burdens on the peasants who funded the empire through their labor. The nobility grew richer, the empire larger, but the gap between ruler and ruled widened further. Still, Catherine's reputation soared. Voltaire praised her as the very model of an enlightened monarch. European courts courted her friendship, and within Russia, the expansion of borders gave her a legitimacy that no coup could tarnish. But as the empire grew outward, shadows loomed within. Catherine had secured land and power, but she had not solved Russia's most fundamental problems. Corruption thrived, serfdom deepened, and unrest lingered. And on the horizon, the winds of a new revolution were beginning to stir, not in Russia, but in France. For decades, Catherine had fashioned herself as the enlightened empress. She corresponded with Voltaire, welcomed Diderot to her court, and embraced the language of reason, tolerance, and reform. In Europe, philosophers celebrated her as proof that a monarch could rule with wisdom rather than tyranny. But in 1789, the very ideals Catherine admired ignited a storm that shook Europe to its foundations. The French Revolution, the first, Catherine watched the events in France with cautious interest. The call for liberty, equality, and fraternity echoed many of the Enlightenment ideas she herself had championed. But as the revolution deepened, toppling the monarchy, executing nobles, and unleashing mobs into the streets, her admiration turned to alarm. For Catherine, the revolution was no longer philosophy. It was chaos. It was the nightmare of rebellion, the spirit of Pugachev resurrected in a new and more dangerous form. The very enlightenment that had inspired her now threatened to devour the order she had spent her life building. Her reaction was swift and decisive. Catherine censored French writings, banned the circulation of revolutionary pamphlets, and tightened her grip on Russian society. She ended her flirtation with liberal reforms, turning instead to a policy of conservatism and control. Nobles who once quoted Rousseau now found themselves under suspicion. Foreign visitors were watched closely. What had begun as a reign of ideas hardened into a reign of pragmatism. And yet, Catherine did not retreat from Europe. On the contrary, she sought to use the turmoil to Russia's advantage. While France was consumed by internal conflict, Russia extended its influence abroad. Catherine strengthened ties with Austria and Prussia, her old partners in the partition of Poland. She presented herself as the defender of monarchy against the revolutionary tide. To conservative Europe, Catherine became not just an empress, but a symbol of stability in an age of upheavaled home. Her reign entered a new phase. The focus shifted from grand visions of reform to consolidation of power. Serfdom, instead of being questioned, was entrenched more deeply. The nobility grew stronger, rewarded for their loyalty. Bureaucracy expanded, but corruption flourished alongside it. Catherine, once the champion of enlightenment, now governed as the guardian of autocracy, and yet she never abandoned her passion for culture. Even in her later years, she continued to collect books, paintings, and sculptures, expanding the Hermitage Museum into one of the world's greatest repositories of art. She wrote plays, essays, and even a manual for the education of her grandson. She remained a woman of intellect, though her vision of progress had been reshaped by experienced her admirers. Catherine remained the embodiment of greatness, a woman who had taken a throne by force, defended it with brilliance, and guided Russia into the ranks of Europe's great powers. To her critics, she was a hypocrite who betrayed her own Enlightenment ideals, enriching nobles while leaving millions of peasants in chains. Both views held truth. Catherine was never just one thing. She was philosopher and autocrat, reformer and oppressor, visionary and pragmatist. As the 1790s wore on, her health began to decline. But even as age and illness crept upon her, Catherine remained restless. She dreamed of new wars, new lands, and new reforms. She plotted to shape the future of Russia through her grandson, Alexander, whom she hoped would succeed her instead of her volatile son, Paul. But history had its own designs. By the mid-1790s, Catherine had ruled Russia for more than 3 decades. She had survived coups, wars, rebellions, and betrayals. She had expanded her empire's borders to an unprecedented scale, reshaped its culture, and cemented her image as one of Europe's most formidable rulers. Yet in her twilight years, the glitter of her reign carried shadows that no conquest could dispel. Her health was beginning to falter. The once vigorous empress, famed for her wit and energy, was plagued by age and illness. Yet Catherine refused to surrender to decline. She filled her days with state papers, correspondence with foreign leaders, and plans for future reforms. Her mind remained as sharp as ever, her ambitions undimmed, but the greatest concern was not her own body. It was the question of succession. Catherine's son, Paul, had long been a source of frustration. She considered him unstable, erratic, and unsuited to rule. Their relationship had always been strained, marked by mistrust and resentment. Catherine feared that upon her death, Paul might undo everything she had built. Her solution was bold. She intended to bypass Paul entirely and name her beloved grandson, Alexander, as heir. Raised under her careful guidance, Alexander embodied the hope of a new enlightened monarch, blending strength with idealism. Catherine poured her energy into shaping him, grooming him to be the ruler who would carry her legacy into the future. But fate would not bend to her plans. In November 1796, Catherine suffered a sudden stroke. She collapsed in her private chambers, unable to speak or move. For 2 days, she lingered, her once commanding presence reduced to silence. Courtiers whispered, servants wept, and the empire held its breath. Finally, on November 17th, Catherine the Great passed away at the age of 67. The news spread quickly. Across Russia, bells tolled and cannons fired in mourning. Europe reacted with awe and trepidation. The Semiramis of the North, as she was called, had departed the stage. She had come to Russia as a foreign princess and left as one of its greatest sovereigns. But in death, Catherine's final wish went unfulfilled. Paul seized the throne immediately, determined to assert his authority. Her papers naming Alexander as heir were never acted upon. The new czar began reversing many of her policies, erasing parts of her legacy almost as quickly as she had built them. Yet the empire she left behind, vast, powerful, and unmistakably European, could not be undone. That Catherine's twilight was not without controversy. Whispers surrounded her personal life to the end. She had loved many men, and even in her last years, she maintained relationships that fueled scandal and gossip. Enemies mocked her as a woman ruled by passion, while admirers defended her as a monarch unafraid to live fully. The truth, as always, was more complex. Catherine used her relationships not merely for pleasure, but for politics, surrounding herself with men who were both companions and instruments of her rule. In the end, Catherine left behind a paradox. She was the foreigner who became more Russian than the Russians, the philosopher who hardened into an autocrat, the woman who ruled like a man but left a reign defined by both brilliance and contradiction. Her twilight was the closing act of a story unmatched in Russian history. But even as her body was laid to rest in the Peter and Paul fortress of St. Petersburg, one question lingered. Was her story truly finished, or had she planted seeds that would only bloom in the century to come? Catherine, too, remembered as Catherine the Great, stands as one of the most extraordinary figures in European history. Her reign transformed Russia from a remote, semi-medieval kingdom into a true European empire. When she died in 1796, she left behind a realm that was larger, stronger, and more culturally vibrant than ever before. But her legacy, like her life, was filled with contradictions. That on one hand, she was the builder of empire. Under her rule, Russia expanded south into the Black Sea, west into Poland, and east across the steppes. She secured Crimea, established new cities, and opened ports that connected Russia to global trade. By sheer force of will and vision, she carved out for Russia a place among the great powers of Europe. Without her, the empire that would dominate the 19th century might never have taken shape. She was also the patron of culture. The Hermitage, today one of the world's most magnificent museums, began as her personal collection of art. She invited foreign thinkers, musicians, and architects to her court, filling St. Petersburg with theaters, palaces, and academies. Russia under Catherine was no longer a cultural backwater. It was a center of intellectual and artistic life. And yet, her reign left deep wounds. Catherine embraced the Enlightenment in words, but not in deeds. She strengthened the nobility at the expense of the peasantry, tightening the chains of serfdom and deepening social divisions. Millions of serfs remained in misery, fueling tensions that would eventually explode in later centuries. Her empire grew stronger, but her people did not necessarily grow freer. She was also the master of paradox. She was a German princess who became the champion of Russian identity. She spoke the language of liberty while ruling as an autocrat. She loved philosophy but feared revolution. She cultivated Enlightenment ideals, yet repressed their most radical consequences. Catherine was neither wholly enlightened nor wholly despotic. She was something more complex, more human, and perhaps more enduring. Her personal life, too, shaped her legend. Few rulers in history have been so scrutinized for their private passions. To some, her relationships with powerful lovers symbolized weakness or scandal. To others, they were proof of her independence and her refusal to be constrained by convention. She lived as she ruled, boldly, unapologetically, and on her own terms. In the centuries since her death, Catherine's image has been endlessly reimagined, sometimes as a ruthless conqueror, sometimes as an enlightened monarch, sometimes as a scandalous woman of desire. But beneath the myths lies the undeniable truth. She was one of the most capable rulers Russia ever knew. Her reign set the stage for both the glory and tragedy of Russia's future. The empire she built would endure for more than a century, but the contradictions she left behind, between progress and oppression, grandeur and suffering, would haunt Russia until the revolutions of the 20th century. And so, Catherine the Great remains a towering figure, not just in Russian history, but in world history. She was not merely a ruler. She was a force of nature, a woman who defied the odds, seized a throne, and reshaped an empire. Her story is not just about power. It is about vision, resilience, and the complex humanity of a woman who earned the title the Great. But perhaps the greatest question lingers still. Was Catherine the last of Russia's enlightened monarchs, or the first in a long line of rulers who would wrestle with the impossible task of modernizing a land caught between East and West? That answer lies not just in her reign, but in the centuries of Russian history that followed.